All right, so back in early 2024, India's Supreme Court did something that, well, it sent absolute shockwaves through the world of political funding. They struck down the whole electoral bonds scheme, right? And that left this massive vacuum. The big question became, where were corporations going to legally park their money to finance political parties? Well, today we're going to dive deep into the system that rushed right in to fill that void: electoral trusts.
Just look at this number for a second. 3,811 crore rupees. I mean, that is a staggering amount of money. And get this, that's how much flowed into electoral trusts in just the last fiscal year. To put that into perspective for you, that's a threefold jump from the year before. We're talking about a seismic shift in how Indian democracy is being funded right before our eyes.
And, that really brings us to the central question of this whole explainer. Think about it. When the tap for all those anonymous donations was suddenly and very publicly shut off, where did all that corporate money go? Well, the answer, as we're about to find out, is a story about a surprising comeback, a new, let's say, flavor of transparency, and yeah, some pretty interesting loopholes.
Okay, so to really get to the bottom of this, here's our roadmap for today. First up, we're going to look at this sudden, massive resurgence of these trusts. Then we'll get into the nitty-gritty, how they actually work. After that, we'll name names. Who are the key players? The big donors, the trusts, the parties getting the cash? Then we'll put the trusts and the old electoral bonds side by side to really see the difference. We'll also ask a really crucial question. Are these trusts a flawed gold standard? And finally, we'll look at what's next, the road to reform.
All right, so let's start with the absolute basics. How do these things even work? Honestly, the best way to picture it is like a giant funnel for political money, just channeling it from the donors over to the parties.
So, at its core, an electoral trust is just a special kind of nonprofit company. Its one and only job is to take in donations and then hand them out to political parties. Now, you might be asking, why wouldn't a corporation just donate directly? Well, because that can be really risky, right? If you openly back Party A and Party B ends up winning, you could face some serious political heat. So, by donating to a trust, which pools money from lots of different companies, that corporation gets a nice layer of insulation. It's supposed to be a pass-through, not a direct stamp of approval.
The whole process is designed to be above board, completely on the record. Step 1, a trust has to get official approval from the tax authorities. Step 2, and this is super important, no cash, none. All the donations have to go through proper banking channels, and the trust has to get the details of every single donor. Step 3, the money goes out to registered political parties. And finally, Step 4, which is the big one for transparency, the trust has to file a detailed annual report with the Election Commission. This report publicly lists every single donor and every single recipient. The idea is to create a complete, unbroken paper trail.
Now, there's a really important rule that's kind of central to this whole thing, the 95% rule. By law, a trust has to distribute at least 95% of all the money it gets in a single financial year. And this is a really critical feature. It's designed to stop these trusts from becoming, political slush funds or giant holding companies just sitting on piles of cash. They're legally required to be a conduit, not a reservoir. The other 5%, they can keep that for their own administrative costs, but that's it.
Okay, so we've got the how down. Now let's talk about the who. Who are the major players in this high-stakes game? We're talking about the donors writing the big checks, the trusts that are managing all that money, and, of course, the political parties who are cashing in.
So you might think there'd be a ton of these trusts out there, right? But the reality is the market is incredibly concentrated. I mean, while there are about 18 trusts registered, a whopping 98% of all the money flows through just 3 of them. The absolute giant in the room is the Prudent Electoral Trust. It handles 70% of the total on its own. It's what you'd call a pooled trust, taking money from lots of different companies. The other 2 big players are pretty much backed by single corporate groups. Progressive Trust is linked to the Tata Group, and New Democratic Trust to the Mahindra Group. So this is definitely not a level playing field. It's an ecosystem totally dominated by a few very powerful gatekeepers.
So, who's actually writing these checks? Well, the donor list really reads like a who's who of Indian industry. We're talking giants from infrastructure, steel, real estate, you name it. But, and this is important, notice the pattern here. A huge chunk of the money comes from really heavily regulated sectors. Think mining, telecom, construction. I mean, just think about it for a second. These are industries where one single government policy decision can be worth billions. That context? Well, it makes their political contributions particularly significant, doesn't it?
All right, let's follow the money to its final destination. Where did it all end up? The data here shows a pretty stark imbalance. In the last fiscal year, the ruling BJP got nearly 82% of all the funds handed out by these trusts. That's over 3,100 crore rupees. And to give you some context on that, that single source accounted for over 60% of the party's entire declared income. The next biggest recipient, the Indian National Congress, got just a tiny fraction of that. The takeaway here is pretty clear. The vehicle for donations might have changed from bonds to trusts, but the money's still flowing, overwhelmingly, to the party in power.
Okay, to really get why these trusts are suddenly so important, we have to put them side by side with the system they just replaced. And what's interesting is, this isn't some brand new idea. It's a funding mechanism that's actually been around for years, just kinda waiting in the wings for its moment to shine.
This whole electoral trust idea has actually been on a pretty long journey. The concept was first pioneered way back in 1996, believe it or not, by the Tata Group. They were looking for a way to ethically handle their political donations. But it wasn't until 2013 that the government officially formalized the whole thing with the Electoral Trust scheme. Then, boom, 2017, the game completely changes. Anonymous electoral bonds are introduced, and because they offered total secrecy, they quickly became the go-to for corporate funding. Trusts didn't vanish, but they definitely took a back seat. And that, of course, brings us to 2024, when the Supreme Court scrapped the bonds, forcing everyone to make this massive, immediate pivot right back to the trust.
So let's break down the key differences here. With the old electoral bonds, transparency was basically zero. It was a complete black box. On the other end of the spectrum, you have a direct donation from a company to a party. That's totally transparent, sure, but it comes with that huge risk of political backlash. Electoral trusts, they sit right in the middle. You could call it a transparency compromise. We, the public, can see which companies donated to a trust, and we can see which parties got money from that trust. But, and this is the key, that direct one-to-one link between a specific donor and a specific party gets blurred because all the money is pulled together. This gives donors what you might call a fig leaf of plausible deniability, while still creating that all-important audit trail that the bonds just didn't have.
So in this new post-bond world, electoral trusts are now the gold standard for compliant political funding. But, and there's always a but, while they are a huge improvement over a totally anonymous system, they're far from perfect. So let's take a look at both sides of the coin.
First up, the pros. The biggest win, by far, is that this system brings a massive amount of political funding out of the shadows and into the formal banked economy. I mean, going from the old days of, suitcases of cash to documented bank transfers, that's a huge step forward. For big public companies, it's also a massive deal for corporate governance. It fits right in with modern ESG standards because it ensures shareholder money is being funneled through a legal, auditable channel. Bottom line, it creates a clear paper trail, and in a lot of ways, it just sanitizes the whole process. But then, of course, we get to the downsides, and the loopholes here are pretty significant. The biggest one by far is this pooling loophole. Let me give you an example. Imagine Company A and Company B both donate 100 crores to the same trust. The trust then turns around and gives 150 crores to the ruling party. As the public, we have no way of knowing if it was Company A's money that went to that party, maybe in exchange for a favorable policy. The trust acts like a shield, breaking that direct line of accountability. And that raises some really serious questions about whether policy is being written to benefit big donors. And when you add in the fact that most of these trusts are staffed by executives from their own founding corporations, well, they start to look less like independent channels and more like a corporate department in disguise. And, this quote from the Association for Democratic Reforms, the ADR, it just powerfully sums up that central criticism. They argue that the sheer amount of money we're talking about and how concentrated it is points to what they call a persistent, unholy nexus between big money and politics. And that, they say, it raises very serious concerns about the potential for the corporate capture of our democracy. Okay, so all of this brings us to our final section, what's next? The road ahead. Now that trusts are basically the only game in town for big donations, the calls for reform are getting louder and louder. So what are the experts saying needs to change to make this system even better? Well, experts and groups like the Law Commission of India have put a few key recommendations on the table. The biggest one, no surprise, is aimed at closing that pooling loophole. The proposal is simple: force trusts to disclose if a donor specifically earmarks their funds for a particular party. That would finally make the link public. Another big idea is to bring back the cap on corporate donations, limiting them to 7.5% of a company's average net profits. That cap was actually removed back in 2017, and bringing it back could help stop shell companies from being used as money funnels. Other ideas being floated are a real-time digital portal for reporting, so we can see the money flow before an election, not months later, and giving the Election Commission more teeth to conduct its own independent audits.
So as we start to wrap this up, it's pretty clear that the comeback of electoral trusts is a really pivotal moment. They really are a vital bridge, moving India's political financing away from the shadowy cash era of the past. And they've brought a huge amount of money into a formal audited system, which is a good thing. But they're not the final destination. The journey towards a truly transparent future, well, that's going to require more reforms to tackle these very real concerns about corporate influence and accountability.
And that leaves us with one final big question to think about. Can transparency in political funding ever really be absolute? Or is it always going to be a compromise between total accountability on one hand and the perceived need to protect donors on the other? Really, the whole debate over electoral trusts is, at its heart, a debate about what that compromise should look like. Now, for a much more in-depth analysis, detailed notes, and even a quick revision mind map on electoral trusts, please be sure to visit our website. You'll find the link right there in the description.